God willing, no problems. Okay, we are starting Tzadi Vav. Today's Amud, middle of the Amud Aleph. All right, the new Parak Hazorek. Okay, and we're moving literally in a slightly different direction because the Gemara is now going to focus away from our discussion of measurements and bring up a whole new area. In doing so, it will also begin to give us some general principles by which a lot of the halacha is based in terms of one domain to another. Okay? We already know certain basic approaches, I'll say. Number one, we know that if one passes an item from one domain to another, okay, on Shabbat, right, that could render a person culpable, okay? We know that if they pass it to a Carmelite, through a Carmelite, they're not going to be culpable. We know that there is a certain height above 10 amos. If you throw it high and it passes in the air, okay, then one is not culpable. We know already that, however, if you pass it below a certain level, near ground level, I'm going to call the phrase, you will be culpable, okay? What about throwing something from domain to domain with a different domain in between, okay? That's where we are headed. Is throwing similar to passing an item, or is it not? Okay? And by extending an object from one domain through an intervening domain to another, what is the status? So that's where we're headed now in this first new Mishnah. Okay? Hazorek, one who throws an object. Mirishut Yachid the Rishut Rabim, from the private domain to the public domain. And then I'm going to read into the word or, Mirishut Rabim l'Rishut Yachid, or from the public domain to the private domain, Chayav, he is culpable. Continues the Mishnah. Mirishut Yachid l'Rishut Yachid, who throws the object from one private domain to a second private domain. Okay? And the Gemara, of course, is going to want to know, are those private domains, are they owned by separate people or are they owned by the same person? Okay? Ureshut Rabim Ba'emtza. And there is a public domain, okay, in between. Okay. Let's take an example. Let's say you have I think of New Orleans because that's where I lived for a while. Okay, in the old city in New Orleans, you have porches, and the porches lean out onto the main street, right? And then you'd have a house across the street that also had a porch, okay? So if you were to throw something from one house, from the porch of my house, let's say to the porch across the street, you'd be throwing it from a private domain through the public domain, in other words, over the street, to another private domain. That's the example I'm giving, okay? Rabbi Akiva Mechayev, according to Rabbi Akiva, one is culpable, B'chachamim potrim. And the sages, however, say that they are exempt, all right? Ketzad, how is that possible? Okay, says the Gemara, Shtei Guzuz Tarot. We have two balconies, okay? Now, we might have the example I gave, okay, balcony, public street, balcony across the street, okay? But let's say I'm in another situation. I am in my balcony and I want to throw it to the balcony that's next to me. Same, on the same building, but it's somebody else's apartment and there's airspace in between. Is that the exact same thing as my throwing over the public thoroughfare? That's one of the issues the Gemara is going to touch on as well. So come back now. How do we say, what are we saying? How is that possible? Ketzad, Shtei Gezuz Taraot, two balconies, Zo Keneged Zo, one opposite the other, okay? They're on either side of the public domain. The first example I gave, right? Right? Zo Keneged Zo Birashut Harabim, and they're each facing the public domain. Okay, going on now. Hamoshit, one who passes. V'hazorek mizo lazo, patur. Okay, one who, so to speak, has a situation where they're on the same side. All right, we'll see in a second. All right, is exempt. Hayu shtehen b'diuta echat. Okay, all right, if one passes it and they're on the same level, the same side of the public domain, Hamoshit Chayav, the one who passes it is obligated, culpable, V'hazorek Patur, but the one who throws it is exempt. Shekach Haita Avodat Levi'im, so because that was the work that was done by the Nevi'im, the Levi'im, Shtei Agalot Zo Achar Zo, one wagon to another. In other words, given our model of the of Mishkan and the building of the Mishkan, the Levites were the one that had to pass the beams from one wagon to another, and so therefore that becomes the model. The Reshut Harabim, all right, they did it in the public domain. Moshitim hakrashim mizo lazo. Okay, because they passed the beams one to another. Aval lo zorkim, but they didn't toss the beams. Okay, so that is our Mishnah. They didn't throw the beams; they passed them. So part again of our question is throwing a similar to passing, because that is clearly culpable. Let's go on now to Tzadi Vav Amud Beis, long text. Okay. However, as we go through this piece of Gemara, we're going to again give these examples. Number one, we said the example, the model of the Levites to the Mishkan. Number two, okay, a second example is going to be raised shortly as well, right? And that is other kinds of sharing or passing of or throwing of items, okay? Tomorrow, Mikdei. Since we're discussing this, Zrika Toleda de Hotza'ahi, are we going to consider the fact that throwing is a Toleda, a second level of carrying out, transferring, right? Hotza'ah Gufa Hecha Kativa. But we come back and ask our question, on what basis do we say biblically that carrying out is actually a prohibited kind of malacha, right? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, says Rabbi Yochanan de Amar Kra, based on a pasuk. Vayitzav Moshe v'ya'aviru kol b'machaneh. Okay, that Moshe gave a commandment, and this caused a proclamation to pass throughout the camp. Okay, so Gemara asks, Moshe, Hechan Hava Yativ, where was Moshe located? Where was he stationed or sitting? B'machaneh Leviah. He was in the Levitical camp. Remember, 3 camps, right? The inner camp surrounded by the Kohanim. Okay, right? Then the Levitical camp, then the rest of the nation. Umachaneh Leviah, Reshut HaRabim Have. And the Levitical camp was public ground, so to speak. Uka'amar LaHoly Israel, and when he gave forth this proclamation to the Jewish people, Lo takif tafiku vetitu merishut hayachid, right? Diadcho l'rishut harabi. Okay, implying that said don't carry out or bring in from private, okay, to the public location, public ground. Umimai de b'Shabbat kai, and how do we know that this proclamation, this statement, was declared vis-a-vis the Shabbat? Okay. Dilma b'chol kai, perhaps on weekday he gave this statement, this proclamation. Umishum dishlema la malacha, and maybe he only gave it because the work on the Mishkan was completed, okay? And therefore there was no need for them to carry or bring items. Kedichtiv, why? Because we have a pasuk that says, V'hamlacha hayta dayam v'gomer, okay? That the stuff that they had brought was sufficient, okay? Gamar ha'avara miyom haKippurim, says the Gemara. No, says what we learn here is that a Gezerah Shava, okay, the phrase that he said, the passing through, the proclamation passed through the camp, okay, we learn a Gezerah Shava, common word association, based on ha'avara from Yom HaKippurim. And here the Gemara is going to give us in detail. K'tiv hacha, it's written here. V'ya'aviru kol b'machaneh. It's written, we said, and they caused the proclamation to pass through the camp. K'tiv hatam, and it's written there, v'ha'avarta shofar tru'ah. In regards to Yom Kippur, it's written there, you shall cause the loud trumpet to pass through the land. Malahalan biyom asur, afkan biyom asur. So same way, we say it's prohibited there on Yom Kippur. So here too, we say it means it is there as a prohibition associated with it. Ashkachan hotza'ah. Okay, so the Gemara says, fine, I've now discovered, or I have found a rationale, Torah basis, to say that carrying out is forbidden. Okay? Hachnesa minalan. What about bringing in? How do we know that that's forbidden? Svarahi. It's logical. We can deduce this from logic. Michdi mirishut lerishutu. Since we're dealing with from one domain, okay, to another domain, okay, right? Ma li afuke, okay, umali iyule. Okay, says the Gemara. What does it mean to say carrying out? Okay, what does it mean to say to bring in? Mihu hotza'ah Av Hachnasa Toleda. Perhaps, nevertheless, we might consider that carrying out is an Av Malacha and the bringing in is a subcategory. Umichdei aha. And let's consider this, okay, as follows. Mechaye, okay, va'aha mechaye, okay. Therefore, on this one, we would consider one culpable, and on this one, we would consider one culpable. So the Gemara raises the question, Amai kari lahai av? Why do we then consider this one a, let's say, a chief principle of malacha, right? All right. Okay. Va'amai kare la hai toleda. And why would you then consider this one a subcategory, right? Nafkamina. What's the difference between them? De'i avid shte avot bahadi hadadi. That if one were to perform or to do two main categories of work, one along with the other, inami shte toledot bahadi hadade, or one performs two, let's call them subcategories of work, one along with the other, mechayev tarte. One would therefore be culpable on two items. V'i avid av v'toleda didei. But if one performs a main category of work and one of its subcategories, lo mechayev elechada. One would only be held culpable as a single act. Okay. Now, what happens? Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. So we now, but what about according to Rabbi Eliezer? The mechayev atoleda bimkom av. Who Rabbi Eliezer, he says, one is performing the subcategory when they do it along with the Av, the chief category. Okay. Amai karu la'av. Why then would you consider calling hotza'ah the main category? Va'amai karu la toleda. And why would you then consider hachnasa, again, a subcategory? So the Gemara continues. Hach dahavai b'mishkan chashiva kari la'av, says the Gemara. That which was considered significant in regards to the Mishkan, that's what was designated as a chief category of work. Hach de lo havai b'mishkan chashiva. That which was not considered significant, important, primary in terms of the Mishkan, was not considered a main category of work. Inami, says the Gemara, okay, or there's also the possibility the following. Hach, the kativa, kare av, that which we have written, in other words, that in which you could find a biblical source, okay, we would call an av, v'hai de lo ktiva, and that which we cannot find a biblical source, that we would call kare toleda. Okay. All right. Everything okay there? All right. Let's go on. Okay. So now we come back. Vaha ditnan hazoreg arba amot bekotel ma'ala. Okay. But here, what about the fact where we've learned in a previous statement, Mishnah, Braita, if one throws an article 4 amos above onto a wall, okay? He throws it in the air and it lands right above on the wall, okay? Me'asrat tfachim, okay, and it's above 10 tfachim, right? Kizorek ba'avir. It's like throwing it in the air, okay? Lamata me'asrat tfachim, if it's lower than 10 tfachim, kizorek ba'aretz. Maybe it's like throwing it on through the land. V'hazorek ba'aretz arba amot chayav. And we say that one who throws something along the ground for 4 hours is culpable. Zarak arba amot berishut harabim minalan. What about the situation if someone throws something, okay, 4 amos in the same domain, okay? Minalan de mechayev. How do we know that one is culpable? Amar Rabbi Yoshia, says Rabbi Yoshia, the following. Our second example. Shekain or gei yiriot zorkin machtehen zelazeh. That those who were the weavers of the curtains for the Mishkan. Okay, I'm getting some, right? Those who were the weavers of the curtains for the Mishkan on the looms would throw, I'm going to call it a spindle, okay, one to another. Or gin, machatin, lamalaho. Weavers, why would they have a spindle? Asks the Gemara. Ella rather, says the Gemara, shekain tofrei yiriot, zorkin machtehen zelazeh. Rather, those who were sewing the curtains for the Mishkan, okay, would throw the spindle one to another. Vidilma, says the Gemara, but perhaps Gabe Hadade Havu Yatve. Maybe they were sitting next to each other, okay? So they could just pass it, right? They would throw their spindles, their needles, one to another, right? So the Gemara then says, Matu Hadadi b'machatim, okay? That therefore they could reach, all right, and pass from one to another their needles, their spindles. Dilma betoch arba havu yatve. Are we sure that perhaps they were sitting within 4 amos of one another? El amar Rav Chisda. But rather Rav Chisda says, shekain oreg yiriot zorkin buchiar b'yiriyah. Okay, that those who were weaving the curtains, they would throw their buchiar. Now, buchiar is, I guess I would call a shuttle, right? It was like a piece of reed that was used on the looms, okay, to thread the wharf and pass it through the woof. V'halo ogdo biyado. Okay, but the Gemara asks, but wasn't this weaver, didn't he still have his hand on this shuttle? Okay, Venischa batra. Okay, so the Gemara tells us, okay, that it was the last throw. When they were finished making a section. Vaha b'makom patur ka'azla. But didn't this take place in a place where they were exempt? Right? Ela shekain or geiriot zokin buchiar l'sho alehen. But rather we say, okay, right, that that the weavers of the curtains would throw the shuttle, okay, to those who requested to borrow it. V'dilma gabi hadade havu yatve. Again, perhaps they were sitting next to each other. Gemara says, matu hadade bechafet. Okay, rather they would strike one another at the end. Okay, at the end of a row, they would then pass it to another. V'dilma shalchufe havu mishlachafe. All right, so perhaps they would make it in a zigzag, in a staggered. Maybe they sat in a staggered fashion, and that's why they weren't doing it. The two, and furthermore, mi sha'ile mehadade, who would be asking them to borrow those. Vahatanya Luda, but didn't Luda teach as follows? Ish mimlachto asher hema osim. Okay, that each person did their own work. Every man did his work, right? Namely, mimlachto hu oseh ve'eno oseh mamlechet chavero. That he did his own work and not the work of his neighbor. So they wouldn't be borrowing the shuttle or the needle from somebody else. The two, and furthermore, ma'avir arba amot bereshut harabim min nalan de mechayev. And even if that's the case, where do we say that if one passes something for amos in public domain, that he's culpable? Elekol arba amot bereshut harabim gemara gemirala. But what we say here is that any amount of 4 amos or more in a public domain is a halacha l'Moshe miSinai. That's how we learn it. Okay. All right, I'm getting some, I don't know, sound feedback there. Okay, let's go on. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Okay, we're now going to move to another, thank you, whoever that was. Okay, another story, right? Since we were citing Psukim, and we were talking about the building of the Mishkan in the Midbar, what other major event occurred in the Midbar? Of course, that is the story of the Mikoshesh Eitzim, right? And the daughters of Tzlafcha. So we sort of digress a moment or two in the Gemara and continue in that direction. Okay? Now, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. It says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel the following. Okay? Mikoshesh, the issue of the person who was gathering wood. Remember? Ma'avir arba amot bereshut harabim. He claims that his transgression was that he was gathering sticks of wood and he carried them, right, for at least 4 amos in the public domain. Right? That was his transgression. Hava b'matnita tana. Okay, and we have a braita, however, that teaches toleish hava, that he was really not just gathering them, but he was actually cutting them, plucking them. Okay, in a sense, pulling twigs off or branches off trees, detaching them. Okay, Rav Acha b'Rebbe Yaakov Amar Ma'amer Hava. Rav Acha b'Rebbe Yaakov says the transgression was that he was tying them into bundles. That's what his transgression was. Lamai nafkamina. So what's the difference between them? Likidarav. It's according to the view of Rav. The Amar Rav Matsati Migilat Starim Be Rabbi Chia says, I found a hidden scroll. Okay, in other words, it was the personal notes of the school of Rabbi Chia. Right? Right? Be Rabbi Chia. Uktiv ba, and it's written, Uktiv be, written on it, Isi ben Yehuda Omer, says Isi ben Yehuda, Avot Melachot Arba'im Chaser Achat. Okay? That the main categories of principal works was 40 minus 1. Ve'im asa'an kulan be'elem echad, and if one does all of them in a single unawareness, ve'eno chayav ela echad, he's only guilty for one. Echad v'tulo, asks the Gemara, one and not more. Okay. But we have a Mishnah that teaches Avot Melachot Arba'im Chaser Achad, that the principal categories of work are 40 minus 1. Vahavinen ba minyana lamali. And when we discuss this, we raise the question of why was a number spelled out. Va'amar Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan gave the explanation. She'im asa'an kulan behelem echad, chayav kol echad ve'echad. That if he does an act where he committed all of them in a single, again, unawareness, he would be culpable for each and every one. Ema eno chayav al echad mehem. Does that mean he'd only be subject to one of them? Right? Rabbi Yehuda pshitale, the ma'avir chayav. Now what we have here is a situation, he said, that Rabbi Yehuda is certain that if he passes something, obviously, right, he is culpable. Umatnitin pshitale the tolesh chayav. And our Mishnah is clear, obviously, that if it was a situation of detaching, then he would be culpable. But Rav Acha bar Yaakov pshitale the ma'amer chayav. And Rav Acha bar Yaakov, obviously to him, that it is bundling things up in piles that would make culpable. Mar savar ha mihat lo misveka. Umar savar ha mihat lo misveka. Okay, one master holds that this is clearly, at least, is no doubt, and another master holds that clearly in this case there is no doubt. So they had their own views as to what the sin was, okay, of this man, this Mikoshesh Eitzim. Gemara, however, is not satisfied since we don't come to a conclusion and continues. Tanu Rabbanan, we have a Braita that teaches Mikoshesh Zet Tzlafchad, that this individual who was gathering, okay, or whatever he was doing, okay, was tzlafchad. V'chein hu omer, and thus, how do we know this? Okay, it says in a pasuk, Vayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar v'yimseu ish v'gomer, that the children of Israel were in the desert, in the wilderness, and they found a man, right, with Mekoshe Shetzim, putting together sticks. Ulahalan hu omer, and later on, the text, however, the Torah tells us that the daughters of Tzlafchad say, Avinu made b'midbar, our father died in the wilderness. Malahalan Tzlafchad, Afkan Tzlafchad, Divrei Rebbe Akiva. Okay, that here too, guessed it was as it was meant Tzlafchad there, so it was meant Tzlafchad here as well. This was the view of Rabbi Akiva. Amarlo Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Says Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, Akiva, ben kach uven kach, ata atid litain et hadin. Regardless of your explanation, at some point you will have to give a response to your determination, to your learning. Im kidvarecha, if you're right based on your drasha, haTorah kisato, the Torah sort of shielded him, covered him up, v'ata megaleoto, and you sort of revealed that he was the culprit. Ve'im lav, and if not, atomotzi la'az ala tot tzaddik. If not, then you are basically casting dispersions on this theoretically righteous person. Let's go on a bit on Sadi Zayin. As you can see, it's a long Amud. Ve'elaha, okay, but rather, he says, we learn it from a Gezerah Shava. Gezerah Shava, lo gamar, ela mehacha hava. If it's a Gezerah Shava, how can Ben Betera disagree with Akiva? It could be that Akiva has only learned the Gezerah Shava on his own and not necessarily something passed down from his teachers. And Ben Betera did not learn it, okay? Namely, Gezerah Shava lo gamar, ela mehacha, but rather from him. Hava mi v'ya afilu, that maybe they learned he was the person who was among the leaders who wanted to go up, okay, and lead the people, okay, immediately to the land. Okay, we'll go just a little bit further. Okay, Hava kiyotze b'davar ata omer. Okay, and another example where Akiva gave a drasha and expounded on something that wasn't clear in the Torah. Okay, says, right, Vayichar af Hashem bam vayelech, and the anger of Hashem was kindled against them, and he departed. Right? Melamed she'af Aharon nitztara, comes to teach us that when Hashem appeared to Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam, after they brought questionable complaints against Moshe, and Miriam was struck with leprosy, that Aaron was also struck with leprosy. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. That's the view of Rabbi Akiva. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Again, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera challenges him. Akiva, bein kach uvein kach, ata atid litain et hadin. Regardless of whether you're right or wrong, you will have to give some sort of a justification. Might get a rebuke. Im kidvarecha, if you're right, haTorah kisato, v'ata megaleoto. Okay, you, the Torah, covered it up, and you reveal it. Ve'im lav, and if not, atomot se la'az ala tohat tzaddik. If not, then you're casting dispersions again on this righteous person. Ve'ela, but rather haktiv, bam, the pasuk says, refers to them. In other words, that Hashem was angry with them. Vaychar af Hashem bam, hahu b'nizifa ba'alma. This was in general a rebuke to the two of them. Okay, what do we mean that it was a rebuke? Tanya, as taught in the Braita, Keman da'amar af Aharon etztara, even if one were to say, okay, that even Aaron was struck with leprosy, dichtiv vayifen Aharon el Miriam, that Aaron looked, right, and he turned to Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. V'hinei mitzorat, right? Tana shepana mitzarato. It means that he was healed from his leprosy, right? And we're going to stop right there for today, okay? And we'll pick up tomorrow.
Thank you,
All right.
Rabbi.
Okay, everybody, stay well. And like I said,
Thank you.
all right.
Okay, thank you. Have a nice day.
All right,
Thank
everybody,
you. Okay, be
take
well.
care.
Bye-bye.
Okay, here we go.